When we talk about regret in relationships, especially when someone realizes they took a good partner for granted, we're really talking about a very human pattern, one I've seen more times than I can count in my work as a therapist. Today's topic, how women start regretting the man they took for granted, isn't about blaming or attacking anyone. It's about understanding what actually happens emotionally, psychologically, and internally when someone walks away from a stable, caring presence, only to later realize the weight of what they lost. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, today we're exploring something that many men experience but rarely get clear answers about. Why regret hits later, why it hits so hard, and what shifts inside a woman that makes her look back differently. I'll be sharing this from a place of professional experience, but also from countless conversations I've had in sessions where someone sat across from me wrestling with the consequences of their choices. Of course, I never share names. Confidentiality is sacred. But the patterns? Those are real and they repeat themselves. What makes this topic powerful, maybe even controversial, is that regret doesn't show up the moment she walks away. It doesn't appear when she thinks she has better options. It rarely shows up when she feels confident in her decision. Regret arrives later, quietly, gradually, and often unexpectedly, and it's important to understand why. As a therapist, I've seen how people often don't recognize stability until they're standing in the middle of uncertainty. They don't value emotional safety until they're faced with the chaos of people who don't offer the same. They don't appreciate kindness until they meet someone who treats them with less care. And regret? It blooms in that gap between what they thought they wanted and what they realized they truly needed. So today, let's break this down gently, honestly, and without judgment. Let's look at the psychological shifts, the emotional triggers, and the quiet realizations that make someone look back and finally understand the worth of the man they once overlooked. 1. When confidence turns into overestimation. In my work as a therapist, I've noticed something that happens quietly in a lot of relationships. Someone becomes so comfortable with the presence of a good partner that they start believing that person will never leave. It doesn't happen suddenly. It's gradual, subtle, almost invisible at first, and it often begins with a very human type of confidence, feeling secure, valued, supported, slowly turning into a belief that the other person will tolerate anything. That shift is where overestimation begins. I've sat across from people who described feeling safe enough to stop trying or comfortable enough to assume the other person would always be there. They didn't say it with pride, they said it with confusion, sometimes even regret. What they thought was confidence was actually the early stage of taking someone's presence for granted. When someone believes they can't lose you, they unconsciously loosen their grip on respect, effort, or appreciation. It's not always intentional. Many times it comes from not fully understanding the emotional value of the person right in front of them. This happens in many relationships. At first, everything feels new, exciting, and worth protecting. But as time passes, the mind adapts. What once felt rare becomes normal. The kindness that stood out becomes expected. The patience that once felt comforting becomes something they assume will continue no matter how they behave. It's a quiet psychological shift, and most people don't see it happening until it's too late. I remember countless moments in sessions where someone admitted they thought their partner would always wait for them to mature, always stay kind no matter how cold they became, always stay patient even when they weren't giving anything back. They didn't realize they were overestimating the relationship's stability. They were overestimating the other person's emotional resilience. They were overestimating their own importance in that person's life. And the interesting thing is this: overestimation isn't rooted in arrogance. More often, it's rooted in familiarity. When someone is treated well consistently, they stop imagining life without that treatment. They assume the loyalty is unconditional, the affection unlimited, the support eternal. That's why they push boundaries, ignore warnings, and downplay your worth. They believe you won't walk away because you've never shown them what it looks like when you do. But this overestimation is also the very reason regret hits hard later, because once the person they underestimated finally steps back, the illusion collapses. They realize the confidence they had wasn't real strength. It was borrowed security from someone they assumed would never stop giving. And when that giving stops, the entire emotional foundation they built starts to crumble. That is the first step toward regret. The moment they realize they weren't as irreplaceable as they thought, and the person they overlooked was far more valuable than they ever recognized. Second, the moment reality doesn't match expectations. There's a point in almost every story of regret that men need to understand because it reveals a lot about human psychology. It's the moment when a woman steps into a new reality expecting it to feel better, lighter, or more exciting, only to realize it doesn't match the picture she created in her mind. This moment is far more common than many men realize, and I've seen it unfold repeatedly in therapy sessions when clients describe the gap between imagination and experience. People don't walk away from a good man because they expect their life to get worse. They leave because they believe something out there must feel more fulfilling. Maybe they think they're missing out. Maybe they believe another person will appreciate them more. Maybe they assume a different dynamic will give them more freedom or excitement. These expectations aren't always rooted in reality. They're often emotional projections, shaped by temporary feelings rather than actual needs. In sessions, I've heard people admit that they imagined a different version of themselves once the relationship ended, more confident, more desired, more in control. The mind builds these fantasies easily, especially when someone feels restless, bored, or misunderstood. But fantasies rarely survive real life, and the dissonance between expectation and reality becomes the first true emotional crack where regret begins to form. This is important for men to understand. When someone leaves you, they usually aren't running from you. They're running toward an idea. That idea might be independence, new attention, or the belief that someone better is around the corner. But ideas don't cook meals, don't show up consistently, and don't offer stability. Real people do. And reality always exposes the difference. I've had clients tell me they never expected the dating world to feel so uncertain. They didn't expect people to switch moods quickly or lose interest within days. They didn't expect communication to feel so shallow or emotional safety to feel so rare. They didn't expect to miss the boring but peaceful parts of their past relationship. They didn't expect loneliness to hit harder than freedom felt. In their mind, the future was supposed to feel bright, not overwhelming. This mismatch, this emotional miscalculation, is often the first time they notice the value of the man they left behind. They start comparing how you handled conflict versus how others avoid responsibility altogether. They remember how you communicated openly while others hide behind vague messages. They recall how you listened with patience while others only talk about themselves. Reality begins teaching lessons their expectations never prepared them for. For men, this is not about hoping she regrets. It's about understanding that regret isn't random. It's a psychological consequence of discovering that fantasies collapse when tested, and stable partners are much rarer than most people realize. Regret begins the moment real life fails to give her what she thought she would find. And for many, that moment comes sooner than they ever expected. Third, seeing the difference between stability and chaos. There's a moment I've witnessed in countless therapy sessions that always shifts the tone in the room. It's when someone who once felt certain about leaving starts comparing what they had with what they have now. And the contrast is so sharp, it's almost uncomfortable for them to say out loud. This moment is when stability becomes visible, usually only after it's gone, and chaos becomes impossible to ignore. What makes this part so engaging is that it rarely happens in one dramatic realization. It doesn't show up in a single argument, a single disappointment, or a single lonely night. It builds slowly, piece by piece, through lived experience. Someone meets new people, new personalities, new communication styles, new emotional expectations, and suddenly the simple, steady presence of the man they took for granted starts to stand out in ways they never appreciated before. I've heard people describe this shift in different ways. One might say, "I didn't realize how safe I felt with him until now." Another might admit, "I didn't appreciate how calm things were." These confessions aren't about missing perfection, they're about recognizing how rare emotional consistency actually is. Men often underestimate the power of their stability. You don't always see it because you live it every day. You think being dependable is normal, being honest is expected, showing care is just what you do. But once someone leaves and steps into a world where inconsistency is common, where intentions are unclear, where emotional games are frequent, your steadiness becomes something they can't ignore. And this is where regret quietly begins to take shape. Chaos isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like unpredictable communication. Sometimes it's emotional immaturity masked as confidence. Sometimes it's someone who seems exciting at first but loses interest quickly. Sometimes it's the lack of accountability, the lack of effort, or the lack of genuine concern for how their actions affect others. As a therapist, I've watched people try to convince themselves they made the right choice, only to break down weeks or months later when that internal comparison becomes impossible to silence. They talk about how simple things, your tone, your predictability, your patience, felt boring or too stable until they experienced the opposite. Now, those same qualities feel meaningful, grounding, and deeply missed. What's most powerful is that the comparison doesn't come from memory alone. It comes from experience, fresh, immediate, present experiences that show them the difference between someone who was committed and someone who is only available when it's convenient. This is why the regret in this stage feels heavier. It's not nostalgia, it's not romanticizing the past, it's recognition. They finally see that the stability they dismissed wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. It was something solid in a world full of uncertainty. And sometimes the chaos of new connections makes the calm they once had feel like something they should have protected instead of walked away from. Fourth, when new attention loses its excitement. There's a point in the regret cycle that's easy to miss from the outside, but unmistakable to the person living it. It's when the excitement from new attention starts to fade, when the thrill that once felt electrifying suddenly loses its shine. I've seen this unfold in therapy sessions more times than I can count, and it often begins with a very honest confession. It felt good at first, but it didn't last. At the beginning, new attention can feel intoxicating. It's light, flattering, energizing. Someone feels noticed again, admired, wanted, and it's easy to believe that this feeling will carry them into a better emotional reality. But attention and connection are not the same thing. Attention comes quickly. Connection requires depth, and depth isn't built in a week. It's built through vulnerability, trust, and consistency. I've had clients describe how that early rush made them feel like they made the right decision when they left a stable relationship. For a little while, the novelty fills the space where comfort used to be, but novelty has an expiration date, and when it fades fast. This is where things become engaging because the shift usually happens quietly. Someone realizes the compliments don't feel as meaningful anymore. The conversations start to feel repetitive. The excitement starts relying on little bursts rather than genuine warmth. They start noticing the lack of emotional follow-through, how someone can be enthusiastic today and distant tomorrow. And suddenly, the attention they once celebrated feels empty compared to the care they used to receive. What often surprises people is how quickly the mind remembers the difference. The way you listened without rushing them. The effort you put into understanding their emotions. The sense of calm they felt, knowing they didn't have to perform to be valued. When new attention loses its novelty, those memories come back stronger, and they aren't just sentimental, they're grounding. I once worked with someone who described this stage as realizing the world doesn't clap the way I expected it to. They didn't say it with bitterness, they said it with clarity. The attention they were receiving from new people felt shallow because it didn't reflect who they truly were. It reflected who they were pretending to be in the moment. And that type of attention always fades. This is the point where regret becomes emotional rather than logical. It's when they begin to miss not just you, but the version of themselves they were when they were with you. The calmness, the honesty, the sense of real emotional grounding, qualities new people rarely offer right away. Men often don't realize how powerful this stage is. When new attention loses its excitement, it creates space for perspective. It forces someone to compare temporary validation with long-term emotional safety. And for many, that comparison becomes the moment they truly understand the difference between being admired briefly and being valued consistently. In that gap, regret begins to gain weight. It becomes less about what they lost and more about what they can no longer replace. Fifth, the emotional void, left by genuine care. One of the most revealing conversations I ever had in therapy came from someone who had been in a long, steady relationship. They sat across from me months after the breakup, trying to make sense of why everything suddenly felt emotionally heavy. They said something that has stayed with me for years. I didn't realize how much space he filled in my life until he wasn't there to fill it anymore. They weren't talking about chores or routines. They were talking about emotional presence, something we don't fully appreciate until it disappears. When someone leaves a relationship where they were cared for deeply, the absence of that care doesn't hit immediately. At first, the excitement of freedom or new possibilities can drown it out, but eventually the quiet moments catch up, the long evenings, the days when things go wrong, the times they would normally reach out for reassurance. That's when the emotional void makes itself known. I remember this particular client describing her new interactions with people after the breakup. She said they were fun, but they were surface level. There was laughter, but not comfort. There were conversations, but not understanding. And the more she compared these moments to the emotional safety she felt in her past relationship, the more she realized that care had been part of her foundation, even if she didn't appreciate it at the time. It's interesting how the mind works. When you're with someone who genuinely cares, it becomes part of your emotional routine. You get used to having someone who checks in, someone who listens without judgment, someone who knows how to calm you when life feels overwhelming. That type of care doesn't feel dramatic or intense. It feels natural, almost too natural, so natural that people often forget how rare it actually is. The client mentioned small things that haunted her in unexpected moments. How he used to notice when she was quiet before she said a word. How he remembered the things she cared about, even when she didn't mention them again. How he stayed patient on the days when she wasn't at her best. She didn't realize how deeply that kind of care shaped her emotional world until she found herself around people who didn't offer the same. This is a common turning point in regret. When the emotional void becomes noticeable, it doesn't show up as sadness alone. It shows up as comparison. Someone starts to realize that the emotional security they once had was not something that could be easily replaced. It wasn't routine, it was connection. And connection requires intention, not just attention. For men, it's important to understand this. Your care leaves an imprint. Even if she didn't acknowledge it while she had it, she felt it. And when she steps into a world where people care only on their terms, not consistently or deeply, that void becomes a mirror. It reflects what she lost and what she realizes she may never find again in the same way. This recognition is often the moment regret becomes undeniable. Sixth, the shift from blame to self-reflection. There's a moment in the regret process that I've seen unfold in therapy many times, and it's one of the most powerful emotional shifts a person can experience. It's when the blame they once placed outward begins to turn inward, not in a destructive way, but in a revealing way. This is the stage where someone who once pointed fingers starts asking quieter, more honest questions like, "What part did I play in this? And what did I overlook?" That change doesn't happen overnight, but when it arrives, it changes everything. When a relationship ends, it's common for someone to initially protect their ego. It's easier to say, "He wasn't enough," or "He didn't understand me," than to admit, "Maybe I didn't handle things the right way." Blame is a shield. It keeps discomfort at a distance. But shields get heavy, and over time, they become harder to carry. In therapy, I often watch people slowly lower that shield once reality begins to contradict the story they've been telling themselves. This is where regret begins to settle into deeper layers. I remember sitting with someone who talked about how she used to think her partner was too predictable, too patient, or not exciting enough. She believed she needed more attention, more excitement, more spontaneity. But as she navigated new connections, she found herself overwhelmed by inconsistencies, mind games, and emotional unpredictability. What she once labeled as boring now looked like emotional maturity. What she once brushed off as predictable now felt like comfort. What she once criticized as too calm now felt like the stability she was craving. In our conversations, she admitted something that marked a turning point. I blamed him for not being what I fantasized about, but I never asked myself whether what I wanted was realistic. That level of honesty only appears when someone is ready to look inward instead of outward. This shift from blame to self-awareness is engaging because it's raw. It exposes truths someone has avoided. They recognize patterns they contributed to, words they shouldn't have said, moments where they didn't appreciate what they had. They begin to realize that leaving wasn't just about what was wrong, it was also about what they failed to understand. For many women who experience regret, this stage is where the emotional weight becomes real. They stop painting you as the problem and start seeing you as a person, flawed, human, but genuinely trying. They stop highlighting the moments you fell short and start acknowledging the moments they took for granted. And when they finally look at the relationship from this angle, it often hits them just how much you gave, how consistently you showed up, and how deeply you cared. Men rarely see this part, but it's one of the most telling signs of genuine regret. Not because someone is hurting, but because they're seeing clearly for the first time. They're no longer protecting their ego, they're confronting their truth. And that truth often brings them face to face with the reality that they didn't just lose someone, they played a role in pushing away someone who was actually good for them. Seventh, recognizing the value of the man she lost. There's a moment in the regret process that feels different from all the others. It's quieter, more emotional, and often arrives long after someone thought they had moved on. In therapy, I've watched this realization settle into people slowly, sometimes painfully, and never in the dramatic ways they expected. It's the moment they finally recognize the real value of the man they took for granted. What makes this stage so powerful is that it doesn't come from longing alone. It comes from clarity. It comes from seeing life without you in full color. Your presence, your consistency, your patience, your emotional steadiness contrasted against whatever they have now. I've heard people describe this moment as the fog lifting or everything hitting at once because they finally understand what they lost beyond the relationship itself. One person I worked with explained it in a way I'll never forget. She said she used to think her partner's qualities were common, that there were plenty of men who communicated calmly, showed up when they said they would, listened without rushing, and genuinely wanted to understand her. But after the breakup, she kept meeting people who lacked even the simplest emotional skills. She found herself exhausted by conversations that went nowhere, confused by mixed signals, and drained by inconsistency. Over time, she realized something she didn't see clearly before. What she thought was normal was actually rare, and that's what many people eventually face. They realize that emotional maturity isn't standard, kindness isn't automatic, effort isn't guaranteed. They begin comparing the way you showed up versus how others appear only when it suits them. They remember the arguments that stayed respectful, the days you supported them without expecting anything in return, the way you took time to understand their moods instead of reacting to them. These memories don't just return, they echo. What makes this stage engaging is how honest it becomes. Someone stops imagining you only as their ex. Instead, they see you as a whole person. They notice how deeply you cared. They remember the sacrifices you made quietly, without asking for recognition. They acknowledge the emotional labor you carried even when you weren't appreciated. They confront the truth that the value you brought into their life wasn't replaceable. It wasn't something they could walk away from and find again easily. There's a point in this reflection where regret settles in fully, not because they want the past back exactly as it was, but because they finally understand the weight of what they dismissed. They realize you weren't just there. You were a source of emotional grounding, growth, and stability that they didn't know how to value when they had it. For men, this stage is important to understand not for validation, but for perspective. When someone recognizes your value after taking you for granted, it's rarely about wanting to rewind time. It's about them seeing clearly, maybe for the first time, just how much you brought into their life. And that clarity is what turns regret from a passing feeling into something real, lasting, and deeply felt. Regret in relationships is rarely sudden. It unfolds quietly, piece by piece, as someone begins to recognize what they truly lost. From overestimating your presence to realizing the gap between fantasy and reality, each stage teaches lessons they ignored while they had you. The stability, care, and emotional consistency you offered often only become clear when compared with what comes after. For men, understanding this process isn't about seeking validation, it's about seeing the patterns of human behavior and knowing your value. Regret is a reflection of recognition, and sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones learned too late.